throwaway account because my real one has photos of my dog, my wedding, and a whole bunch of things that now feel like props from a life that doesn't exist anymore. I'm a 32-year-old woman from Ohio, and a few weeks ago I walked in on my husband, Evan, in our bed with my cousin. Yeah. That cousin. Blood cousin. Grew up together, shared toothbrushes, cried in each other's arms cousin. Before anyone jumps in with "how did you not know," let me be honest about something that's ugly but true. Our marriage wasn't some Instagram perfect fairy tale even before all of this exploded. Evan and I loved each other, yeah, but we also fought. A lot. We argued about money, about sex, about how emotionally distant he could be, about how I was always too intense and overthinking everything. We did that thing couples do where you pretend you're fine in public and then go to war behind closed doors. We met in college, built a life together from nothing, survived the broke years and the stress and the boring adult routines, but somewhere along the way, the spark turned into something tired and resentful. We weren't screaming at each other every day, but we weren't exactly happy either. It was more like we were roommates who still slept in the same bed out of habit. That context matters, because it's how everything slipped under the radar. My cousin, I'll call her Lena, moved in with us about 8 months ago after blowing up her long-term relationship. She showed up with 2 suitcases, red eyes, and that fragile "I'm trying not to fall apart" energy that makes you want to protect someone. Evan was the one who insisted she stay with us instead of crashing on friends' couches. "She's family," he said. "We'll help her get back on her feet." I remember hugging him and thinking, God, at least he still has a heart. At first it was chaotic but kind of nice. 3 adults under one roof, drinking wine too late, venting about our exes, watching dumb reality TV. Lena and I slipped back into our old rhythm easily, like we were teenagers again, whispering secrets in the dark. Evan was around more, too. More present. More engaged than he'd been with me in a long time. That should have been my first red flag. Slowly, things shifted. Lena started hanging out in the kitchen whenever Evan was cooking. Evan suddenly had way more opinions about her outfits. They'd exchange these little looks, these half-smiles that felt like inside jokes I wasn't in on. And when I brought it up, even gently, Evan would roll his eyes and say I was being paranoid, that I was reading into nothing, that my trust issues from the past were coming back. So I swallowed it. Because part of me was scared that if I pushed too hard, I'd confirm something I wasn't ready to face. One night, I came home early from work and found them sitting way too close at the dining table, their heads bent together, whispering. When I walked in, they both jumped apart like they'd been electrocuted. I laughed it off, made a dumb joke about them plotting against me, but inside something cracked. Not broke, cracked. Like a hairline fracture in glass. From that point on, I couldn't unsee it. Evan working late more often. Lena taking longer showers. The way they'd stop talking when I entered a room. The way Evan would suddenly get defensive if I asked where he'd been. Then came the Tuesday. The day everything ended. I'd had a brutal day at work, emails piling up, my boss on my ass, that slow, grinding stress that makes you feel hollow, and I texted Evan that I was coming home early. No reply. Which wasn't weird, but it made my stomach twist anyway. When I pulled into the driveway, both his car and Lena's were there. The house was quiet when I walked in. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. Like something was holding its breath. Evan? I called. Nothing. I went upstairs, expecting to find Lena in her room and Evan in his office or something stupid and boring. Lena's bedroom door was open. Empty. That's when I heard it. A low laugh I knew too well. Evan's. And then a softer sound, breathy and familiar. Lena's. It was coming from my bedroom. My feet moved before my brain caught up, each step down the hallway feeling unreal, like I was walking through someone else's nightmare. The door to my room was half closed, and I remember this absurd detail, the little gap of light spilling out onto the carpet, like it was mocking me. I pushed the door open. And there they were. On my bed. In my sheets. Under our wedding photo. Evan, naked, hands on Lena's hips. Lena, on top of him, tangled up in my husband like she belonged there. For a second, time just stopped. Evan saw me first. His face drained of color so fast it was almost impressive. Lena turned around, gasped, and yanked the sheet up to her chest like that somehow made this less disgusting. No one spoke. I felt this cold, unreal calm spread through me as I took in every horrible detail, like my brain was recording it for later torture. "Get out," I said quietly. My voice didn't sound like mine. Lena immediately started crying, whispering "I'm so sorry" over and over like a broken toy. Evan tried to get up, but I held up a hand. "Don't. Just don't." I walked out of the room, down the stairs, and sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen while my entire life collapsed upstairs behind me. And that was just the moment I caught them. It wasn't even close to the worst part. Part 2. I sat on that couch for what felt like hours, even though it was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, listening to the sounds of them upstairs moving around, drawers opening and closing, muffled voices trying to stay quiet as if volume was the problem instead of the fact that my entire marriage had just been detonated. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to tuck them under my thighs just to keep them still, and I remember thinking that it was weird how my body was reacting so violently while my mind felt almost numb, like it had put itself into some kind of emergency power-saving mode. Eventually, they came down. Lena was wrapped in one of my blankets, her hair messy, her eyes swollen and red, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her, which almost made me angry in a way I didn't know how to explain, because she had no right to look like the wounded one. Evan followed behind her, fully dressed now, his face tight and pale, the confident, sarcastic man I'd married replaced by someone who looked like a scared kid about to be called into the principal's office. They stood there in the living room like two guilty defendants waiting for a verdict. I didn't invite them to sit, but they did anyway, perching on the edge of the armchair and the ottoman, leaving this weird, empty space between us that felt like a physical manifestation of how far away they suddenly were from me. Evan kept opening his mouth like he was about to speak and then closing it again, while Lena just cried quietly, tears sliding down her face and dripping onto the blanket, as if the performance of remorse might somehow undo what they had done. Finally, I asked the only thing that mattered. "How long?" Not "how could you?" Not "why?" Just "how long?" They looked at each other, and that alone told me everything I needed to know, because people who have nothing to hide don't need to coordinate their answers. 3 months, Evan said quietly. 3 months. That meant it had started when Lena was already living with us, eating the food I bought, sleeping under the roof I paid for, hugging me and telling me she loved me while she was also sneaking into my husband's bed when I wasn't home. I laughed then, a sharp, ugly sound that didn't match how I felt inside, because something about how absurdly cruel it all was made my brain short-circuit. "So you've been screwing my cousin in my house for 3 months, I said, my voice still strangely calm, "and neither of you thought to mention that little detail." Lena started talking all at once, tripping over her words, telling me it wasn't supposed to happen, that it was a mistake, that she was in a bad place emotionally and Evan was just there for her and things got complicated and confusing and she never meant to hurt me, which was almost funny because hurting me was literally the only thing this situation was capable of doing. Evan tried to jump in, saying that our marriage had been struggling, that we hadn't been connecting, that he felt lonely and unseen and that Lena made him feel wanted again, and something about the way he said it made my stomach turn, because it was like he was trying to turn my pain into a relationship self-help seminar. "So you fixed your loneliness by banging my cousin," I said, staring straight at him, "and you thought that was a reasonable solution." He flinched, like I'd physically hit him, but he didn't deny it. What came out over the next hour was worse than anything I'd imagined, because once the truth started leaking, it didn't stop. They told me it had started with late-night talks in the kitchen, with Lena venting about her breakup and Evan listening in that intense, attentive way he hadn't listened to me in years, which already felt like a betrayal all on its own. They admitted there had been flirting, lingering touches, jokes that crossed lines, until one night when I was out late at work, they drank too much wine and ended up kissing, which of course turned into more than kissing because apparently boundaries mean nothing when you're horny and selfish enough. After that, they kept doing it. In my house. In my bed. Sometimes while I was literally downstairs watching TV or folding laundry. Lena said she hated herself for it, that she tried to stop, that she felt trapped in it, which made me want to scream because no one was holding a gun to her head and forcing her to climb into my husband's arms. Evan said he knew it was wrong but he didn't know how to end it without blowing everything up, which was another fun lie because everything was already blown up, I just hadn't been allowed to see the smoke yet. The worst part wasn't even the sex. It was the emotional stuff they admitted to, the inside jokes, the private conversations, the way Evan had been confiding in Lena about me, about our fights, about my flaws, about the things that frustrated him, while I was upstairs thinking we were just having a rough patch like any normal couple. They had built this whole secret little world inside my life, and I had been the only one not invited. By the time they finished talking, my chest felt tight and raw, like I'd been breathing in smoke for too long. I stood up slowly, because sitting there listening to them justify the worst betrayal of my life was starting to feel unbearable. "Lena," I said, my voice finally shaking, "you need to pack your things and leave tonight." She looked at me like I'd just told her she was being disowned, which, in a way, she was. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered. "You should have thought about that before you decided to have sex with my husband," I replied, feeling this bitter, vicious strength I didn't know I had. Then I turned to Evan. "And you," I said, "can sleep somewhere else, because you are not getting back into that bed." He nodded, tears in his eyes, saying he understood, that he was sorry, that he loved me, that he wanted to fix this, which sounded insane coming from someone who had just ripped my heart out and set it on fire. That night, Lena left with her suitcases and Evan went to stay at a friend's place, and I was left alone in the house that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Because what I found out next made the betrayal feel even deeper than what I had already seen with my own eyes. Part 3. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute, because every time I closed my eyes I saw them in my bed again, their bodies where mine was supposed to be, their laughter echoing in my head like it had soaked into the walls of the house itself. I ended up sitting on the floor of the bedroom with my back against the dresser, staring at the mattress like it had personally betrayed me, replaying every small moment from the past few months and wondering how many of them had actually been part of their secret. Sometime around 4 a.m, my phone buzzed. It was Lena. A long message. Of course it was. She wrote about how sorry she was, how ashamed she felt, how she never meant for things to go this far, how she was in a dark place emotionally and Evan made her feel safe and wanted when she felt like nothing, and how she didn't know how to stop once it started. She said she loved me and that she hoped someday I could forgive her, because losing me would hurt more than anything. I read it 3 times, and every time it made me angrier, because the way she wrote it made it sound like this whole thing had just happened to her, like she'd been caught in a storm instead of deliberately walking into someone else's marriage. I didn't respond. Then Evan texted. His message was longer, more desperate, full of apologies and self-pity, saying he knew he'd destroyed everything, that he hated himself, that he would do anything to fix it, that he still loved me and that what he did with Lena was a horrible mistake fueled by loneliness and confusion. Loneliness. Confusion. 3 months of sneaking around, lying to my face, and having a full-blown affair with my cousin, and he was calling it confusion like he'd just taken the wrong exit on the highway. I didn't reply to him either. Later that morning, when the sun finally came up and made everything feel even more surreal, I started doing the thing people do when their entire reality collapses, which is trying to find more truth, even when you already know it's going to hurt. I logged into Evan's laptop. I knew his password, because we'd been married for 6 years and we'd once trusted each other with stupid things like passwords and bank accounts and our actual hearts. Part of me felt sick for snooping, but a bigger part of me needed to know just how deep the knife had gone. What I found made me feel physically ill. Messages between him and Lena going back months, filled with flirting, inside jokes, little comments about how they missed each other, how they couldn't wait to be alone again, how hard it was pretending nothing was happening when I was around. There were plans for when I'd be out of the house, excuses they'd coordinated, lies they'd told together like it was some kind of twisted team sport. And then there were the things Evan had said about me. That I was controlling. That I was cold. That I didn't understand him. That I made him feel small. Reading those words from the man I loved, sent to the woman who betrayed me the most, felt like someone peeling my skin off one layer at a time. Lena hadn't just slept with my husband. She'd listened to him talk about me, about our marriage, about my flaws, and instead of telling him to go fix his relationship or shut up, she'd leaned in closer. I called her. She answered on the second ring, her voice shaky and soft, like she was already crying. "Why didn't you tell me how long it was really going on?" I asked, because the messages showed it had started weeks before the kiss they'd admitted to. There was a pause, and in that silence I felt something inside me finally give up. "I didn't want you to hate me," she whispered. "I already do," I replied, and hung up. Evan showed up at the house later that day, standing on the porch like a ghost, asking if we could talk, saying he needed to explain things, but I told him through the door that I'd seen the messages, and the sound he made on the other side was enough to tell me he knew he was caught in more lies than he could ever fix. That was when I realized this wasn't just about an affair. It was about how easily the two people I loved most had decided that I was disposable. And that realization was what finally turned my shock into something much darker, something that was going to change everything about how I handled what came next. Part 4. After Evan showed up at the door and realized I'd seen the messages, something shifted in him, like he finally understood that there was no version of this where he could talk his way back into my life without confronting the full ugliness of what he'd done, and for the first time since I caught them, he stopped trying to sound like a sad husband who made a mistake and started sounding like someone who was terrified of losing control of the story. He kept texting, calling, leaving voicemails, switching between apologies and defensiveness so fast it gave me emotional whiplash, saying he loved me one minute and asking why I was spying on him the next, as if my snooping was somehow on the same moral level as him sleeping with my cousin for months. I didn't answer any of it, because every word he sent just made it more obvious that he was still more focused on how this affected him than on what he had done to me. Meanwhile, Lena went silent for a couple of days, which almost felt worse, because I knew her well enough to recognize that when she stopped talking, it usually meant she was spiraling or plotting or both. I was right. 3 days after I kicked them both out, my mom called me. Her voice was tight and confused, asking me why I hadn't told her that Evan and Lena were in love and that I had apparently thrown Lena out on the street in the middle of a mental health crisis, which was such a wild, distorted version of reality that for a moment I couldn't even speak. Lena had gotten to her first. She had told my entire family some carefully edited story about how she and Evan had developed feelings for each other, how it was complicated and painful and not anyone's fault, and how I had reacted violently and irrationally by kicking her out with nowhere to go, because apparently betraying your cousin and sleeping with her husband for months qualifies as a romantic tragedy if you phrase it right. By the end of that day, half my family was texting me, some of them angry, some of them worried about Lena, and almost none of them asking how I was holding up, which was when I realized that she wasn't just willing to steal my husband, she was also willing to steal my reputation. I sent screenshots. I sent my mom, my aunt, my sister, and anyone else who tried to lecture me about compassion and forgiveness the actual messages between Evan and Lena, complete with dates, flirting, and explicit proof that this had not been some innocent emotional connection that accidentally crossed a line. The responses were chaotic. Some people immediately apologized and took my side, horrified by what they saw. Others doubled down, saying I shouldn't be airing dirty laundry and that family issues should stay private, which was an interesting stance to take when the dirty laundry involved two people literally having sex in my bed. Lena called me screaming, telling me I had ruined her life, that everyone hated her now, that I had no right to share private messages, and I just listened in silence until she finally ran out of breath, because there was something deeply satisfying about not giving her the emotional reaction she clearly wanted. "I didn't ruin your life," I said calmly when she paused, "you did that the first time you climbed into my husband's bed." Then I hung up. Evan, of course, lost it when he realized the truth was out, because suddenly he wasn't the misunderstood romantic hero in Lena's story anymore. He was just a married man who cheated with his wife's cousin, which is about as bad as it sounds no matter how you spin it. He showed up again that night, pounding on the door, begging me to talk to him, saying we could fix this, that he would go to therapy, that he would cut Lena out of his life forever, that it was her who had come on to him first, which was both cowardly and pointless, because at this point it didn't matter who started it, only that he had chosen to keep going. I opened the door just long enough to tell him that I was filing for divorce. The look on his face, that raw, desperate panic, was the first time I felt like the power had shifted back into my hands, even though it came at the cost of everything I thought my future was going to be. That night, as I lay alone in the bed that no longer felt like mine, I realized that what I was grieving wasn't just my marriage, but the entire version of my life I had believed in. And there was no going back. Part 5: What I Learned After the Smoke Cleared. The weeks after I told Evan I was filing for divorce felt less like time passing and more like I was drifting through the wreckage of a plane crash, stepping over pieces of what used to be my life while everyone else kept asking me to explain what had happened, as if there were some version of this story that made sense. I went through the motions of being a functional human being, showing up to work, answering emails, making myself eat when my stomach twisted at the thought of food, but everything felt distant, like I was watching myself from a few feet outside my own body. Evan kept trying to contact me, even after I told him to stop, because apparently losing his wife wasn't enough of a consequence for him to finally respect a boundary, and his messages bounced between self-hatred and entitlement in a way that made it impossible to take any of them seriously. One day he would write that he had destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him, that he couldn't live without me, that he was starting therapy, and the next he would be asking if we could just meet for coffee to talk things through like we were breaking up after a normal, mutual drift instead of a betrayal that involved my own blood. Lena, on the other hand, went quiet after the family blow-up, which I later found out was because she was staying with a friend and dealing with the fallout of everyone finally knowing the truth, and part of me wanted to feel bad for her until I remembered that the only reason she was dealing with any fallout at all was because she had tried to paint herself as the victim instead of taking responsibility. What surprised me the most was how many people expected me to be the bigger person, to forgive, to move on gracefully, to keep the peace for the sake of the family, as if my pain was somehow an inconvenience that needed to be managed instead of a direct result of what they had done to me. I learned very quickly who was actually in my corner and who was more interested in pretending that nothing too uncomfortable had happened. The divorce process itself was ugly in a boring, bureaucratic way, full of paperwork and meetings and conversations that felt surreal because they were all about splitting up a life I had thought was permanent, but at the same time there was something oddly grounding about it, because every form I signed was another step away from a man who had proven that he didn't deserve my loyalty. Evan tried one last time to talk to me in person, showing up at a mutual friend's place where he knew I'd be, and when he asked me through tears if there was any chance we could start over, I realized that the answer was no, not because I didn't still feel something for him, but because I finally respected myself enough to know that loving someone who was capable of doing what he did would mean betraying myself all over again. As for Lena, I haven't spoken to her since the day I told her she ruined her own life, and I don't plan to. Because some relationships don't end with a dramatic final conversation, they just die quietly when you realize that the person you loved never actually existed in the way you thought they did. I'm still not okay, not really, but I'm also not broken in the way I was afraid I would be, because there is a strange kind of strength that comes from surviving the thing you thought would destroy you, and every day I wake up a little more certain that my life doesn't have to revolve around people who chose to hurt me. So I guess my question, if anyone actually made it this far, is this: when the people who were supposed to love you the most turn out to be the ones who betray you in the worst way possible, how do you rebuild trust without closing yourself off from the world entirely, and how do you stop wondering if you somehow deserved what they did? Because I'm trying to move forward, but some days it still feels like I'm walking on glass, and I don't know how long it takes before it finally stops hurting.